Welcome to the Dinghy Safety Module. This module describes some of the safety risks and hazards associated with using a dinghy or tender and appropriate safe handling. Many fishing boats are equipped with a small dinghy or tender to transport crew, fishing gear, equipment, or other items between the boat and shore, or between two boats. In some instances, a dinghy will be used on a daily basis to gain access to a fishing boat from the shore or jetty, or perhaps even as a fishing platform. When not in use, the dinghy may be tethered to the fishing boat's mooring or a jetty. In other instances, the dinghy will be used infrequently, particularly on larger fishing vessels that may spend many days at sea. On these vessels, the dinghy may be located on the wheelhouse roof or attached to the rigging, and will require careful lowering into the water when required. Careful dinghy preparation is necessary to ensure a safe and comfortable trip. If the dinghy is on the shore or tied up alongside a jetty, several pre-departure steps will be necessary, including checking the fuel tank has adequate fuel in reserve for the intended trip, that the fuel line is connected to the outboard engine, that the outboard engine is firmly attached to the transom, and that the propeller and water intake is clear of obstruction. If an electric start is used, it is necessary to check that battery terminals are secured and that the power tilt mechanism to raise and lower the outboard is operational. Also check that drainage bungs are firmly in place and bail out any water that may have collected in the dinghy. It is also important to check that the required safety equipment is on board the dinghy. It is an AMSAR requirement that dinghies or tenders less than 7.5 meters, used for transporting purposes only, are required to carry one life jacket per person, one bailer, a set of oars or other secondary means of propulsion, and a waterproof buoyant torch. If used in remote enclosed sheltered waters or more than 2 nautical miles from land, the tender is required to carry 2 orange and 2 red flares. Remote enclosed waters are those where assistance from shore or other vessels is not readily available, and rescue services would be required in an emergency. An anchor with chain and rope is also a useful addition, and perhaps a basic toolbox and some spare parts in case of breakdown. If the dinghy is on shore, it can now be dragged into the water and steps taken to load it with crew and other items. Steps should be taken to equally spread the weight of crew and other items to keep the dinghy balanced, although too much weight near the bow will prevent it from planing. When crew step into a dinghy, they should do so with their weight as close to the center line as possible, to keep the dinghy balanced and avoid weights shifting, man overboard, possible flooding, and/or capsize. All individuals should be wearing a life jacket or PFD before they step into the dinghy. These precautions also apply for loading a dinghy tethered to a jetty, although in addition all individuals must take care to avoid feet or hands being crushed between dinghy and the jetty. If the dinghy is lowered into the water using a davit, it is important that the lifting ropes, shackles, blocks, and other equipment are in good working order. Ropes and shackles should be inspected regularly and replaced if old or worn. Blocks should be well greased. It is important to check that no one is standing underneath the dinghy as it is being lowered. To prevent the dinghy from swinging, a crew member should hold the end of a long rope attached to the dinghy. This is particularly important if the fishing vessel is rolling at anchor, to prevent the dinghy swinging uncontrollably and hitting the vessel. The crew member must also be standing clear, well away from the dinghy. It is a good idea to double-check that the drainage bungs are in place before the dinghy is lowered. You would be surprised how often this step is forgotten. When the dinghy is in the water, it must be tied alongside the boat, well clear of any engine cooling water outlets. A flooded dinghy is obviously not a good start. Fenders should be put in place if not already attached to the dinghy. If an outboard engine is used, it may need to be lowered to an individual standing in the dinghy. It should be lowered slowly using a rope to take its weight, because the individual has to maintain their balance as they move it into place and then fasten it to the transom. The fuel tank and any other items may also need to be gently lowered into the dinghy, including safety equipment. The fuel hose can now be connected to the outboard, and pre-start checks made. A kill switch should be attached via a lanyard to the driver of the dinghy. This switch tethers the driver to the outboard and stops it instantly should the driver fall over in the dinghy or overboard. Sadly, over the years many individuals have been run over and killed by their own boats after falling overboard, all because they did not use a kill switch. Everyone on board and any equipment or other items, the outboard can be started. The outboard should immediately be checked to ensure it is running smoothly and that a steady stream of cooling water is being pumped from the outboard. Before putting the outboard into gear, a final check should be made, including that everyone is seated, that all items are stored correctly so they will not move, and that there is sufficient space to pass other boats or navigation hazards close by. When satisfied that all is in order, the ropes holding the dinghy to the jetty or vessel can be released. These ropes should be quickly pulled on board so they do not foul the propeller. Fenders should also be pulled on board. The outboard is then put into gear, taking care to maneuver the dinghy clear of the jetty or vessel. A reminder to individuals to keep their hands inboard to avoid crush injuries and to hang on is useful at this point. The speed of the dinghy must not be excessive. Care is required to ensure that crew and items on board are not excessively tossed about, which may cause injury or damage. It is also important to keep everyone and everything dry. Factors to take into consideration regarding a safe speed include the number and weight of individuals and all items on board, sea conditions, water depth, presence of rocks or reefs, the presence of other boats, navigation markers, or other obstacles, and the availability of additional engine power to get out of trouble if necessary. If a crew member falls overboard, it is essential that recovery is as quick as possible. In a small dinghy this can be done in a matter of seconds, although care is required to ensure they are not struck by the dinghy or outboard engine, with potentially fatal results. If the dinghy has sufficient freeboard, it may be possible to come alongside slowly and haul the crew member on board, although the dinghy will likely list dangerously. Shifting some weight to the opposite side of the dinghy may be an effective option. Alternatively, the crew member may be hauled in over the stern. In both instances the outboard must be in neutral gear to avoid injury to the crew member. First aid assistance should be applied if necessary, including treatment for hypothermia. As the dinghy approaches another boat or jetty, it is essential to reduce speed and ensure that tie-up ropes are ready and fenders are in place. The driver should assess the situation to determine the safest way to approach the boat or jetty, and may need to account for tide, sea, or wind, as well as available water depth. Typically, the approach is made at an angle with the bow of the dinghy closest to the boat or jetty. If a beach landing is to be made, then particular care is required to prevent swamping or capsize by waves, or damage to the dinghy or outboard by hitting rocks or the beach at speed, particularly if the outboard is not tilted upwards in time. A bow and stern line are usually the minimum requirements to tie up a dinghy to the wharf. If other crew are on board, they can help tie up the dinghy. Once the dinghy is in place, the outboard can be turned off and tilted to lift the propeller clear of the water. As crew climb out, they need to take care to minimize rocking the dinghy and potentially falling overboard. Care is also required to ensure fingers and toes are not crushed between the dinghy and vessel. Fishing gear and other items should be lifted out carefully to minimize rocking the dinghy. If manually lifted by crew, they should position their weight as close to the center line as possible, and brace themselves for the rocking motion of the dinghy. One or more crew members may need to be seated on the outboard gunwale to act as a counterweight. Items that are heavy or bulky may need a secure rope attached, that can be pulled on to help the crew lift the item on board. It also provides a means to recover the item if it falls overboard. Items that are too heavy or difficult to lift manually may need to be winched on board. Congratulations! You have now finished this module. Now let's review the material covered.